Hi, English 300. It's me, Dr. Fred Ash, your professor, trying my very first ever online lecture. I'm trying to record on something called Screencast-O-Matic from a PowerPoint, um, and it's not working again. Let's see. There it goes. Okay. So what I'm going to do is go through the first of these essays, the what is reader response criticism, and just sort of pick out the things that frankly matter to me that you get a handle on before the exam. Hint, hint. This time I will break this lecture up, I think, into two. One on the what is reader response criticism and the awakening essay, um, and the next one on Paula Treichler's reader response essay on the awakening, just to sort of practice. So let's kind of launch in right now. I've gone through this text and tried to put it in a PowerPoint. Um, and you can sort of see my notes, and I'm just going to hit some highlights. So we'll start on page 336. The first thing that I wanted to uh, point out is this notion right at the beginning that reader response critics raise theoretical questions about whether our responses to a work are the same as its meanings, whether a work can have as many meanings as we have responses to it, and whether some responses are more valid than others. They ask what determines what is and isn't off the wall. What, in other words, is the wall, and what standards help us to define it. I just like that because it reminds me of the diagram I drew on the board a couple of weeks ago, where I put a rectangle in the middle that was an arena or a field, and that was textual meaning. Remember, I had a circle on the left that was the writer, a circle on the right that was a reader, and that meaning could cover all of the different areas within that rectangle, that field, but there were boundaries, and there were such things as out of bounds. Okay, moving to the next one at the top, I think this is worth pointing out, even though we don't do too much, and I think a theme of this lecture and even of this chapter is that reader response in practice doesn't end up being very different from formalism / new criticism at all. At the top here of page 338, they quote this is a guy named Ross Murfin who wrote this essay and who edited the original Bedford Critical Editions here, so I will refer to Murfin as the writer of these essays. Murfin quotes a guy named Stephen Mallieux, I'm not sure what his actual name is, who talks about moves that a reader might make or things that a reader response critic might do. All three of them, you'll see, have to do with finding examples or instances of reading or interpreting within the text, which is an interesting thing to do. And I have done it on the text Maus, the graphic novel about the Holocaust by Art Spiegelman. I've written a couple of papers on that, and in one of them I looked at different places where the characters were either explicitly reading something or trying to work out or interpret something, and used it to tie to a whole. So use that part, instances of reading, to tie to the whole of the question of how interpreting texts was a crucial survival strategy in the Holocaust. If you think about it, when the Nazis would put up a work order, for instance, the Jews would have to read that and determine, is this real or is this a trap to move us into a smaller ghetto or on into the concentration camps? So there's still a part for a whole there. It's still a sort of close reading, but the theme has to do with reading itself. And I think all three of these do that, essentially. So I find that interesting. I don't know if it's crucial. This is crucial. I'm coming over to 339 and the affective fallacy. So he is now quoting Louise Rosenblatt. I don't care if you know that name, but she is essentially saying that the reader response critics were responding to the new critics or the formalists and she uses that interchangeably, as do I, and specifically to their affective fallacy. You need to know what the affective and intentional fallacies are. Both of those are things that the new critics thought were mistakes in looking at how we read texts. So the new critics believed here that the affective fallacy was a confusion between the poem and its results, that it took into account how the poem made the reader feel or what made the reader think, and that was out of bounds. Reader response critics say, no, it's not out of bounds. Again, I'm not sure that once they say that, they end up doing anything all that different for the most part, and we'll see some exceptions later from the new critics. But know what the affective fallacy is. This is the first time I think we get the name Stanley Fish. We get his name several times. That is one of two names from this chapter that I'd like you to remember. All right. At the bottom here of page 339, Fish talks about how reading is a temporal process as opposed to a spatial process. So when we think of reading as a spatial process, we're essentially thinking of reading, of rereading. When we read a text the first time, we see things as they unfold in the text, and they happen over time. So it's very hard to relate something that we read on page 1 to something that we haven't yet read on page 12, for instance. But when we reread the text, we can see how page 1 foreshadows page 12, how it sets up a structural motif or pattern with other elements on pages 6 and 8. These are all made-up numbers, so that essentially it becomes a spatial as opposed to a temporal process. According to Fish, reader response critics are focused on the temporal part instead of the spatial part. He has a pretty interesting example over here on 340 with Milton's Paradise Lost. Again, though, and you can read that on your own, I think ultimately a new critic would do the same thing that he's doing. Okay, I'm skipping down, but again, not to give you something you have to remember. This reference on the bottom of 340 to Wolfgang Iser, that's the guy I took the arena theory of meaning from. He's talking about filling in gaps or blanks. Very interesting. Coming back to Stanley Fish at the top of 341, and I like this distinction that he makes. Fish reveals his preference for literature that makes readers work at making meaning. Obviously, if you're in a college English class, we also prefer things that seem to have multiple meanings and that you have to work at a little bit. Fish contrasts two kinds of literary presentation. One is rhetorical presentation, which he describes as literature that reflects and reinforces opinions that readers already hold. And the other is what he calls dialectical presentation, which he refers to as works that prod and provoke. I don't actually know or use those terms, rhetorical or dialectic. I use small L literature and capital L literature. Small L literature being works that essentially confirm your pre-existing prejudices or hopes. Capital L literature being works that challenge those, and that to me is the difference in the works that we teach versus others. Okay, let's see. I think I will go on here. Just on 342, there's a long discussion, and none of these distinctions are important for you to remember, but it's nice to be aware of them. Who is this reader? And that's a way that that reader response critics kind of slip out of the full implications of reader response, which we'll talk about in a minute. In other words, if we can define this reader as an informed reader, an intended reader, an implied reader, a narratee, or a competent reader, then we can essentially assume that that reader is doing the same thing that the new critic is doing, which is seeing within the bounds or off on the wall of the text and figuring it out from there. Now, this gets a little weird when we get over here to the subjectivists on 343 in the middle. So I'm going to start reading this paragraph. Since the mid-1970s, however, reader response criticism, once commonly referred to as the School of Fish, I'm guessing you all remember that, has diversified and taken on a variety of new forms, some of which are truly incommensurate with formalism or new criticism, with its considerable respect for the integrity and power of the text. For instance, subjectivists like these people, Blyk, Holland, Crossman. I've heard of Norman O. Holland. I haven't even heard of the other two. You certainly don't need to remember those names. Have assumed that what Maliev calls the absolute priority of individual selves as creators of the text. This is a radical subjectivist reader response. This is the concept that the reader creates the text and that almost anything goes in the way that you read it. I don't know too many people who read that way, but when we hear the term reader response, we sort of think that this means it just means what I think it means. I think that's kind of crap. Let me go back up here to the paragraph before, and Malio's essentially at this point kind of calling Fish and the School of Fish out and saying through a vocabulary focused on the text manipulation of readers, Fish was still effectively, especially effective in extending and diversifying the formalist practice that continued business as usual within literary criticism. That means, essentially, yes, that classic reader response starting in 1970-ish with Fish and Easer and people like that was rejecting theoretically the affective fallacy, but was still defining the reader in a way that let them read as formalists or new critics, so that they didn't look outside of the text at things like politics, race relations, gender relations, etc. Now, if we come back down here to David Blyk, or maybe it's Holland. Anyway, it's this identity theme. It's what they find in the text is, in Holland's phrase, their own identity theme, they as readers. So from the subjectivist or radical reader response thing, essentially everybody is finding their own identity and confirming their own identity in the text. Holland has argued that as readers, we use the literal work to symbolize and finally to replicate ourselves. I may have told you at some point in graduate school, I sort of learned the idea that all criticism is autobiography. Your dissertation is your autobiography. In other words, something draws you to interpret texts in a certain way. And if you're paying attention to yourself, you tend to come back to the same themes in different texts once you become a pretty solid reader. So that's radical reader response, subjectivist reader response, something that we don't, I think, almost ever take to its fullest implication. But I think the identity theme within bounds does describe the way a lot of people read and probably does account for a lot of the new forms of criticism like gender, like post-colonial, like feminism, etc., Marxist criticism, and on and on. Okay, switched over here to 344, and the seventh thing that I've got here is a sort of reader-oriented criticism, and I'm pointing this out because this is a critic I really like, Janice A. Radway. She has a book, and it's not the book he's talking about specifically here. He comes over here and talks about it. She has a book called The Resisting Reader, which is about being a woman trying to read classic American literature, which very often gives no place for the female reader in the text. And so essentially, finding feminist themes in classic stuff. I told you Stanley Fish is one name